Due to the graphic language in this interview, viewer discretion is advised.
Your kind exchanges leave behind a soul you have to take. Kerosene, it goes clean down and leaves behind a trace of wishful thinking and regret held back by your own lack of depth and sense enough to see the truth it seems. Standard current history extracts the truth from what I see. It all comes back around the whipping tree.
Shae, welcome to Outside the Gray on Outlaw Theology with the Whiskey Preacher. Thank you so much for joining us for this interview.
Thank you, Phil. It's an honor, and I appreciate it.
Shae, you and I have been friends for several years now and have shared some significant milestones in our lives. And even though our journeys have taken us in very different places at times, and we've embraced different symbols to express our faith, if I may be so bold to say, we are still see each other as important voices in each other's lives. Now, with that said, I would love you to share a little bit about your story where you grew up Southern Baptist and even went to a Southern Baptist college. What did that experience look like for you, and how did it shape you for who you are today?
Great question, Phil. Yeah, one of the things that for me, growing up Southern Baptist, it wasn't part of who we were as a family. It really was a great part of who we were as a family. It was a significant, both in its impact and in, I would say, the percentage of its value to us as a family. We were the kind of family that, we were there Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night for training union, for youth. We were there Monday night for visitation. We were there, for choir rehearsal. We were there basically when the doors were open. We were there. I grew up in the same Baptist church, which is probably a fairly unique thing. I mean, we went the same place from the time we had moved to my hometown when I was 3-ish, and we were at that same place until I went off to college, and under the same pastor that whole time as well. So there was a lot of stability, there was a lot of routine, and that was a really significant part, both not only as a participant, but also as a contributor. My parents were both very active in the youth department. So I had an older brother, and when he was in the youth department, I was in the youth department. And just growing up in all of that, by the time I was, say, 15 or 16, I really was a fairly large contributor to the youth program. I guess you would say I was a leader in the youth group. And then when I decided to go off to college, actually had a chance to go to a few different places and decided to go to East Texas Baptist University because of the calling I felt on my life at the time to embrace full-time ministry as a vocation, as an occupation. And so when I went off to ETBU, that was sort of the heritage I brought with me.
Backing up a little bit, when did you realize that Southern Baptist expression of faith no longer gave you adequate tools to express where you were at in life?
For me, Phil, it really was partially that college experience. When I went off to East Texas Baptist, I was always sort of part of my personality. I'm sure you already know this. Part of my personality has always been a little bit of the rebel, a little bit of the guy that goes against the grain. You know, when I was in high school, the form that took was to be as conservative as I could among my high school peers that say weren't as conservative. So you know, that was how that nature sort of manifest itself, so to speak. When I went off to college and was surrounded by conservatism, then that nature took on a little bit different face. And it was in that process for me of trying to, you know, mete out who I really am as an individual, beginning that individuation process from where I was in my heritage to kind of coming to fruition in my own sense, in my own beingness, I guess, so to speak. There was this yearning for finding something that was more me, I guess. I remember thinking at the time, I was in the middle of East Texas, and it was a very, very conservative town. And my mindset was, okay, you know, I'm at a Baptist school. I need to find a church. So I'm just going to go fully me, and whoever accepts me, great, you know, they get me, kind of thing. And so I would go to different churches on Sunday morning in my blue jeans, my t-shirt, you know, my long hair, my earrings, whatever. And in a small Texas town in the early 90s, that was not exactly a normal occurrence for them. And I kind of cycled through, I guess, about a dozen churches, and finally, a dozen Baptist churches, finally came upon this really, really great community, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church there in Marshall, Texas. Fabulous people. And they were I think the first real expression at that point of community, of sort of unconditional love that I had ever really understood in those tangible ways at that point in my life. And so I think the first thing was that experience of community and acceptance outside of that previous subculture. But I think it went beyond that for me. I always had this sort of interest in other expressions. I even remember when I was a child being very distraught and discussing this with my parents through tears. You know, I wanted to learn about things like Buddhism, like Hinduism, and I remember saying to my parents even then, you know, how do I know that this is not true and that this is true when I don't even know what this is? And you know, growing up, I think I don't necessarily want to demonize the Southern Baptist world over and above any others. But I think growing up in that tradition, there was a great deal of fear. And for me, fear had kind of ruled everything. Every decision I had made was based out of fear. And I think the other side of that story is once I got into college, I think I began to experience more of a life outside that fear. I began to wonder what that might look like as I yearned to know God, as I yearned to express my faith in ways that seemed more consistent with this idea that perfect love casts out all fear. You know, we were taught that all the time, perfect love casts out all fear, yet I had grown up in this place that seemed to thrive and nourish on fear in that particular tradition, or at least in that context, in that church. Not to say that it was all bad. Like I said earlier, it was a great influence, and there were a lot of great things that came out of that in my life. But the fear seemed to be one of the lasting marks. And so experiencing that love, experiencing sort of a little bit of the absence of that fear, that began to be kind of the, if I can use this phrase, kind of the leaven, the yeast that kind of started to slowly work its way through my entire being until it finally came to fruition.
This seems like a common theme within the rest of your story, and I don't want to fast forward too far in your story, but I want to point out that seeking truth, the actual process of seeking and not necessarily finding the truth, but the seeking part is what really has brought you into different stages of your life to where you are now. And it's been a very formative process for you. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would say that it's not just fair to say, but it's pretty accurate. I remember early on, one of my favorite authors late in high school was a musician and sort of music critic and somewhat of a free thinker in the Christian writing world, a guy named John Fisher. And he had a couple of really great books that impacted me significantly at that time. And one of the phrases that I just kept thinking over and over and over that he wrote in one of his books was, you know, we used to sing this song all the time, Jesus is the answer for the world today. Above him there's no other, Jesus is the way. And if we really, truly believe that, then why in the world are we so scared to ask the questions? And that just resonated so much. And then arriving at ETBU, one of the professors that I still keep in touch with today just had such a significant impact on me that he kept using this phrase. That was the first time I'd ever heard it, this idea that all truth is God's truth. Well, what in the world does that mean? And it continued to bring out that part in me that said, you know, there's something in me that desperately wants to know. And I trust that whatever is there put that in me for a reason. And to not follow those questions would be, quite honestly, to be a bad steward of that part of my personality, to deny something that was God-given. And so to honor that part of me, I've always just had this very, very strong thirst to know as much as I can. And trust me, there are times that I realize I don't know nearly as much as I think I do. The older I get, the more okay with that I become. But I want to know as much as I can.
So you went from being Southern Baptist and doing ministry in a Southern Baptist church to a Presbyterian church in middle of East Texas, and eventually you migrated to the Vineyard Church. Can you tell us a little bit, for those of us who don't know anything about the Vineyard Church, what that is and what you did for them, which you became a worship leader there? And what exactly is a worship leader? And what does a worship leader do?
I will say that the thing that led me to the evangelical Presbyterian community in East Texas was the very same thing that led me to the Vineyard Church when I got back to Houston. The Vineyard community of churches, the association itself, kind of started out of the hippie Jesus people movement in the 70s in Southern California. And that was a really strong time of this sort of resurgence of bearing all of the weight of the gospel and everything about the New Testament church, but stripping away all of the trappings of religiosity, so to speak. A little bit, a great deal actually, but you know, how far can you strip away religiosity and still maintain a sense of religion and cohesiveness? But truly, it was a very open community in a lot of ways. You know, I was on staff there for a number of years, 7-ish, 8 maybe. I think by the time it was all over, it was probably around 7. But as worship leader, it was my responsibility for a couple of different things through the years. Primarily to lead the worship on Sunday mornings, which for the Vineyard Vineyard is mainly known for two distinctive things. Number one, being a church planting movement. So the idea is that they are a church that plants other churches. And the second thing is that they've got a really strong sense of worship. At the time, there were probably three record companies that released and recorded Christian worship music, and Vineyard was one of the top threes, and has gone on to spur all sorts of other movements and other music phenomenons, really, in that subculture. So as worship leader, my job was to maintain and direct a rotation of bands, primarily, pretty full-on rock bands. We constantly under the gun about our decibel level, and push the edge as much as you can in those types of environments. But it was a great time. It was a time of really just this honest and very, very culturally contextualized expressions of honor and yearning for God. And so within the Vineyard context, it was just a really powerful time. And, our average attendance was, I think, just about an average of 500 to 600 on a weekly basis. We had a couple of different services on Sunday morning. And throughout the time, I also was responsible for nurturing and developing a community of artists. We had a tremendous artistic community. Everybody from actors, painters, professional actors, painters, musicians, sculptors, you name it. And it was part of my responsibility to help them nurture that growth. In fact, it's kind of funny, especially looking back in all the different ways that this has impacted my life. Back in college was kind of the first time I ever became a huge Doors fan, and to this day, the Doors are just one of the greatest bands influence in my life. And there was a line from one of Jim Morrison's poems that just says, "Oh, great creator of being, grant us one more hour to perform our art and perfect our lives." And since college, that's been kind of my mantra, my goal, is that prayer every day. Just grant me one more hour to perform my art and perfect my life. So I think the Vineyard was a really great place to start to kind of work some of those things out and see what that looked like.
After doing the worship leader gig at a fairly large church in Houston, after you'd moved back from college, you had decided to plant a church. You start your own church. You were coming out of a tradition now that encouraged church planting. And for those who really are not familiar with that term, church planting means that you are commissioned in most places to go and start something new, a brand new church from scratch. And you, Shae, chose Baytown, Texas, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, south of Houston. And you chose to name your church the Refinery. Can you tell us a little bit about why you chose Baytown, and why did you decide to call it the Refinery, and what drove you to start a church in the first place?
Baytown is actually about 25 miles east of downtown Houston, and it is the refinery mecca in a lot of senses. For a while, I actually lived right across the street from the largest ExxonMobil refinery in the country. So there's a big refinery presence there. We've got Exxon, we've got Bayer, we've got Chevron, we've got a few other smaller ones around those different complexes. And so it's very much a blue-collar town. It's my hometown. It's where I grew up. And when we decided to plant a church, there was a team of us from the Houston Vineyard that were commissioned to go out. It really was with this idea of doing some things a little differently, even though, the Vineyard was already sort of on the edge of sort of mainstream Christianity and a lot of their models and a lot of their values, and we wanted to kind of push that further. And so, for us, the typical Sunday looked a little bit different than even the Vineyard. We had communion every week. We had a pretty extensive worship time, and then our, I guess for lack of a better phrase, our sermon times were very much more like conversations. I would typically throw out about a 15 to 20 minute premise, kind of parse out maybe some verses of scripture or some thoughts on a specific passage, and then we would have a conversation about it, and we tried to maintain a sense of cohesiveness, whether or not there was a dozen of us there or 70 of us, and it was a struggle. We had some pretty crazy ideas on how to do church, but we were still the church in the most basic senses. It was a good thing to try. I don't have any misgivings about having tried that. Would I try it again? No. But there were a lot of cool things that came out of that.
How long did the refinery go for until it started falling apart? And around the same time it started falling apart, so did your personal life. What really happened there?
I think we ran about 2 years from start to finish, and it was a pretty big triumph, we felt, to make it past the first year. A lot of church crap. Start over. It's a good question. We made it about 2 years, I think, when it was all said and done. We were very excited about the time spent. Most church plants, a large majority of them, actually never make it past the first year. So when we made it past the first year, it was a big triumph for us. And I remember it was about a year in that things began to really change drastically for me on a personal level. And even then, I remember being very concerned and speculative about where it was heading. My family and I were on vacation in Virginia. We were there for the 400th anniversary of Colonial Williamsburg and all those festivities that it entailed. And on the way up, I remember I had just picked up a book. Phil, you may be familiar with Spencer Burke, a guy who started the Ooze and really sort of on the bleeding edge of church thought back around the 2000s. And he had just come out with a book called A Heretic's Guide to Eternity. And I picked it up, quite honestly, because I thought, well, if there's a book that I'm going to read, this looks like a good one. So I started reading it, and it just blew my mind. It began with a basic premise of, what if everything that we fight and die for that aren't the essentials of our faith, what if we're wrong? And what if we're wrong about the way we treat people that we see as different than us? I remember it was beginning to give voice to a lot of my thoughts at the time on the issue of gender equality, on sexual equality, and it really, it didn't voice anything that I hadn't thought of. What it did was articulate very clearly and very succinctly the things that were already sort of germinating in my own mind. And I remember on vacation reading that book in 24 hours and emailing every pastor I knew and saying, do not read this book. It will mess you up. And I promptly read it again, and about a week later I bought 30 copies of it and handed them out to every family in our church, because I wanted to kind of let everybody see the page I was on and the things I was thinking through. And it was on that same vacation, shortly after reading that book, I found myself in a museum in the area of Colonial Williamsburg, and it had this gigantic timeline of basically human history. And I remember seeing the most recent event on that timeline was the World Trade Center bombings of September the 11th, 2001. And it stretched all the way back to right around, I want to say about 15,000 BC. And it was gigantic. It spanned several hundred feet, and it was really fascinating to go along and see different things on the timeline that I was familiar with, at least slightly familiar with. Things like the trials at Nuremberg, things like the bombing of Hiroshima, things like Napoleon at Waterloo, things like the American Revolution, and it would just span all the way back, and it got to, the birth of Christ. It went back to Abraham and his settling in the Middle East, and it just kept going back, and it kept going back. And these thoughts just kept echoing in my head the whole time I'm looking at this, because when you're talking 2000 AD and 15,000 BC, you're talking about boats in Japan in 15,000 BC. That's a pretty viable civilization. You're talking artwork and pottery in Peru and in Mesopotamia that looks similar, with similar artwork. Around 12,000 BC, carving stones. And you're not talking about Neanderthals. You're talking about people with a pretty good grasp of tools and craftsmanship and physics and all these concepts that we think of as pretty high-level thinking. And you've got that so far back, and I remember looking at this timeline and thinking, what we have in the Bible, and this is, I'm still a pastor at this point, what we have in the Bible is just a little snapshot of human history. I mean, in totality, we've got about a third of human civilization as far as the timeline goes. And if we believe and have this idea that God is never changing, God is always the same, and God is speaking, then what was he saying for the first 2/3 of human civilization? And that was the moment that Pandora's box sprang open, and I thought, oh no, I can't close this thing. It's open, and I can't close it. So what am I going to do with this? I have to be a good steward of this box, and I have to see how far the rabbit hole goes.
You got